Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Anaf Kalam, and I will be moderating today's discussion. We are pleased to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Sam Westrop, who is the director of the Middle East Forum's Islamist Watch project. Sam is the primary author of the Middle East Forum's groundbreaking report on USAID's financing of Islamist terrorist organizations around the world. In the report, Mr. Westrop and other MEF researchers have uncovered at least $122 million of taxpayer funds being sent by USAID and the State Department to organizations aligned with US-designated terrorist organizations. Now, as the MEF report has been making the rounds in the media, has been investigated by the House DOGE subcommittee and been reviewed by the White House over the past few weeks, we can expect today's discussion to go past our usual 30 minutes, as there is quite a lot to unpack here. We will begin with a discussion about the report, and then, as always, we will open up the floor for your questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I welcome Mr. Sam Westrop. How are you, Sam?
I'm well. Thank you for having me on. As you pointed out, this subject is in the news, so it's good to have a chance to really dive into the weeds.
Yeah, so I will jump right in and kind of go to the beginning, go to the background of all this for those who haven't really followed our report. So why has the Middle East Forum been looking into federal funding, and what does it have to do with Islamism?
So we've been tracking federal funding of Islamist groups since at least 2017. This followed my move from the UK, where we track government spending there, because one of the things we noticed in Europe was that Islamism thrives on government monies. It's not just about the dollar amounts received, it's about the legitimacy that then affords these groups. It helps them cement leadership over Muslim communities. It helps obfuscate their finances and discourage audits, all those sorts of things. No one was doing this in the United States. The Middle East Forum started in 2017, and with almost every examination of a federal department agency, we uncovered problems. We uncovered extremists, terror-aligned organizations subsisting on taxpayer dollars. So this is an enormous problem. It didn't start off purely from a terror finance angle. It started off because we know that Islamists seek public monies. They have always done this, and they always continue to do this. The terror finance sums uncovered were far greater than we anticipated, however. So this has somewhat switched the conversation to more of a terror finance question, but more broadly, across the entire federal government, it's one, yes, more broadly, of extremism.
Thank you. Now, so why the focus specifically on USAID, and what exactly did your report uncover?
Well, two reasons for the USAID report. Firstly, October 7th. In the wake of that attack, we started looking at the very significant Hamas network operating in the United States, which was far removed from the Hamas network of old that the federal government focused on in the 2000s. You know, listeners to this podcast might remember groups like the Holy Land Foundation, Islamic Association of Palestine. They're old news. There are dozens of new charities you haven't heard of operating in Gaza, and supporting Hamas welfare operations as they're there. Too many of these groups, we discovered, are funded by the federal government. And where does that money come from? Primarily USAID. So USAID, it turns out, it provides the biggest tranche, the biggest bulk of taxpayer dollars to Islamist aid charities. Now, there are other departments, including USAID's parent organization, State, that give some monies, but USAID is the bulk. And you mentioned some figures at the beginning, and 122 million we found went from USAID and State to groups aligned with terror. A slightly broader figure of 164 million went to radical groups more broadly, radical Islamist groups more broadly from State and USAID. So we're talking very large sums here. You know, the amount of monies coming from USAID and State accounts for roughly half of the entire federal government's funding of Islamism. So it makes up the plurality and near the majority of taxpayer support for radicals.
Now, in your report, you identify apparent violations of sanctions and material support laws. How did USAID specifically, their beneficiaries, break the law?
In quite a few ways. We've been stating for now quite a few years that we are finding not just hints of illegality, but outright violations of federal law, both sanctions and also even material support law. I think the best example of this would be, and let me start actually with a non-USAID example, just to show you the spread here. So if you take a group like Rama Worldwide, very prominent Michigan charity, it signs agreements with Hamas Politburo members in Gaza. It wears the logo of a designated terrorist organization on the jackets of the charity workers operating in Gaza. And it openly collaborates with other Hamas fronts. This group is funded by the Department of Health and Human Sciences, and it happens to have had some nice meetings at the White House over the last few years. So on the one hand, you've got very overt material support questions here, because it's not only partnering with Hamas fronts, it's actually taking money and exchanging funds with a designated group in Gaza as well. Then you have the slightly more murky indirect subsidy of terror. You have USAID funding groups like the Unlimited Friends Association in Gaza, or another group, the By the Association in Gaza. Both of these organizations are Hamas front organizations, but they themselves are not designated. And the federal government 10, 15 years ago might have been more willing to prosecute, well, a bit more than 10, 15 years ago, almost 20 years ago now, might have been more willing to prosecute such organizations, or at least at the very least refuse to fund them with taxpayer dollars, because they understood a pretty important principle for a while post 9/11, and that's when you help terrorists build homes, you're helping terrorists build bombs. The federal government 20 years ago understood that a welfare and charitable system was key to a terrorist group's operations. They used this system of charity in places like the Gaza Strip, not just to legitimize themselves, but to serve as recruitment tools, a way to fungibly hide money. It's very important, and it's not limited to Hamas. Everything from broader ideological movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami to other terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda in Mali have used charity and welfare to accompany their violent extremism. So this is the other side of illegal USAID funding, or rather USAID funding that may break the law. Money's going to the charitable proxies of designated terrorist organizations. And it's not just Gaza. You know, a group called Helping Hand for Relief and Development we exposed in 2018 was partnering with Lashkar-e-Taiba in Pakistan. Lashkar-e-Taiba is the terrorist group that carried out the 2008 Mumbai attacks, among many other horrible acts of violence. And Helping Hand for Relief and Development then got authorized for $188,000 of USAID funds after that incident, after that information was reported, after Congress wrote to USAID as well and said, hey, what are you doing? Why are you working with this group? USAID still went ahead and funded this organization that was partnering with Lashkar-e-Taiba and its proxies in Pakistan. So yeah, violations of all sorts. Okay, there's also the question of treasury sanctions. You know, a lot of the people, groups, Western charities that receive USAID monies are working with are not just on the designated terrorist organizations, but arguably fall under sanctions lists as well. So there's a lot to look at here, and it really comes down, I think, to a question of political will. I mentioned that 20 years ago the federal government had a very different understanding of what terror finance can encapsulate. Now it's a choice whether to prosecute these charities or not. And certainly the first Trump administration, the Obama administration, and the Biden administration chose not to prosecute. And I know I'm slightly getting away from the question here, but now I've started, I'll continue the point. It remains to be seen what a second Trump administration will do. But for the last, well, since about 2008, the federal government has very actively turned a blind eye to this behavior. They know it's going on. We know they know it's going on because we've told them it's going on, and they have turned a blind eye. And the message one receives time and time again from committee members and certain federal employees is that the federal government regards these examples of terror finance and the problem of, say, USAID funding of these groups as a minor issue to be ignored, because these groups are useful assets in the long-term fight against terrorism. In other words, Hamas, Lashkar-e-Taiba, all these other examples we've identified of taxpayers' money subsidizing terrorism abroad are seen as acceptable behavior by the federal government, acceptable sacrifices in a broader strategic battle against Islamism. What do I mean by that? Well, for quite a long time, the federal government has treated Hamas groups in particular as assets in the fight against Al-Qaeda, against Salafi jihad. The Muslim Brotherhood, especially, and this policy was developed very much in the Obama administration, the Muslim Brotherhood is a potential ally in the fight against Salafi jihad. So work with Hamas to defeat ISIS doesn't actually make sense on the ground, but for some of the architects in DC, this is how the thinking went. There was a good political Islam, there was a bad political Islam. USAID funding, very arguably, has been given to these groups, and these groups therefore have not been prosecuted because, as part of that mindset, as part of that very explicit decision to embrace one arm of political Islam while in the fight against another. And that's a frightening prospect to receive, because it really means actually we weren't just looking the other way as money went to these groups, we were actively funding designated terrorists.
Unbelievable, almost comical. Now, of course, we know the organizations and the beneficiaries that have engaged in unlawful conduct. Can you comment on whether federal officials themselves actually broke the law?
Possibly. And I won't be, one has to be careful here, because not only did we write this report, but the Middle East Forum's director, Greg Roman, recently testified before Congress, and the committee there has talked about referring prosecutions and so on. So, there are people looking at this who can make better decisions and offer better reasoning than I can. There are examples, however, where we think USAID officials should perhaps be investigated, indeed federal officials more broadly. The big one is a 2014-15 grant to World Vision, a big evangelical charity, Christian charity, which was working at the time with a designated terrorist organization in Sudan called the Islamic Relief Agency, ISRA. We wrote about this in 2017, and some of the people listening might actually remember the media coverage around then, because there was huge global coverage of our findings. The reason it's become relevant again is people are now casting a more skeptical eye back to that time and wondering if perhaps more illegality went on than was admitted. Now, what happened in that case was that World Vision convinced the federal government to let them fund this designated terrorist organization, ISRA, this Sudanese Islamic Relief Agency, the Sudanese Islamist group. What we found out through a mix of open source research and FOIA requests was that certain federal officials had actively participated in lobbying Treasury to authorize the transfer of this money to this designated terrorist group. In fact, there was even a UN official operating in the office of Samantha Powers, who was then, at the time, the Obama administration's UN ambassador to the UN. We found an official operating in her office took it upon himself to actively encourage Treasury to delist this designated terrorist organization. Lots of interesting things happening in a very short space of time around 2015. It certainly looks like, at the very least, some appalling misconduct by federal officials acting on behalf and funding a designated terrorist organization. At worst, this may have crossed the lines into something illegal. Whether that same illegality, that same criminality extends to the matter I discussed earlier, which is the very deliberate funding of terrorist organizations abroad as part of a strategic ideological mission, that remains to be seen. I think more will come out on that as various committees look into this. More documents come available from USAID. I think at the very least, and be good for us all to listen to the Inspector General's office at USAID, who have been investigating this with some efficiency over the last few years, despite being stonewalled and ignored by the rest of USAID. And that their finding is very clear, that at the very least, there is an appalling system in place that allows radical actors to benefit from millions of federal dollars. So criminality may be proved further down the line. For the moment, no. Though the absolute mission of the new administration has to be stop this from happening, shut this down, make sure that no more violent extremists, whether radicals here in the United States or terrorist groups overseas, continue to receive federal dollars. There's a lot to look at here.
Now, this next question here could obviously take up an entire podcast episode on its own, but some of the funding seems to be carried out lawfully, yet of course MEF is still calling for action to be taken. So how does lawful charitable work also benefit these terrorist organizations?
Yeah, well, I mean, I sort of touched on that earlier a little, but it does remain absolutely key to the way Islamist groups operate, both in the West and in the East. As I say, when Al Qaeda took over Mali, when was it? Around 2012, and at the height of their power, they could be found dropping off prescription drugs to the villages under their control. At the same time, they were engaging in quite brutal acts of violence. The Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, especially around the 30s and 40s, made a name for itself by providing charitable services in villages in rural Egypt. Hamas came to power by being the incorruptible welfare voice of the Palestinian people in the face of the intransigent and corrupt Palestinian Authority. So welfare charity is key to Islamism. A lot of Islamist groups, especially the Brotherhood and similar Islamist movements, refer to this, in fact, as dawah, which is proselytization, but they see it as such an important act that they consider it an act of proselytizing to fellow Muslims, the Islamist cause. And charity is the perfect medium to do that. So this works here in the West as well. It's no coincidence that Islamist movements in the West set up vast charitable infrastructure. And we track, about 7,000 Islamic organizations across the United States, both good and bad, both Islamist and not. And by far the wealthiest, the most active are the charitable movements within that non-profit industry that's been established by American Islam. It operates billions of dollars of annual revenue. It's an extremely wealthy, extremely powerful set of charities. Now, we track about 200 Islamist humanitarian aid charities, but there are more smaller ones. And it's not just the groups you've heard of today, the Muslim Brotherhood, Jamaati Islami, but smaller Salafi movements, Deobandi, which is a South Asian Islamist movement. The most famous offshoots include the Taliban. The Shia Islamists, South Asian Shias have their own charitable infrastructure based down in Texas and Florida. There's a lot going on with Islamism and charity in the US and in Europe and elsewhere, and as we've discussed, around the world. So yes, lawful behavior is very much part of all of this. And we draw attention in our report to lawful groups receiving these USAID monies and other federal subsidies at the same time alongside the violent extremists, because what do these charities do with this monies when they're not funding terror, when they're not funding terror proxies? They're using this to advance extremist ideas. So take Mercy USA for Relief and Development. It's the descendant of a charity that was accused of quite radical Salafi jihadi links back in the 90s, but today mostly operates in places like Gaza and other places, but in collaboration with more mainstream elements, at least in the eyes of the international government. So it operates with the UN Relief and Works Agency, for example. So questionable organizations, but not quite as overtly Hamas fronts as something like the Unlimited Friends Association, which I mentioned earlier. And Mercy USA primarily uses its government subsidy, not for the overt funding of terror abroad, but to advance extremism here at the home. So if you look at the rhetoric of its officials and its activities across across the United States, you see overt support for extremist rhetoric about Jews, about Islamist ideas, and so on. So this is the other side of federal funding. It's going not just to terrorists abroad, but proponents of radical ideology here at home. Groups like the Reach Educational Fund is a very important pro-Hamas organization operating across the US, where it raises money here for scholarships and other things in Gaza. Most of its activities are spent here domestically, promoting radical speakers and radical ideas within mosques and other community centers and so on. So there's a huge amount to draw attention to, because our huge contention is that the federal government is not just subsidizing violent extremism abroad, it's helping shape Islam here in America for the worse. It's helping give Islamists control over community centers and mosques and whole Muslim areas of the United States by funding the wrong people, by legitimizing the radicals as the representatives. So there's just a huge amount here, and the USAID report we publish is really just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to federal funding. And if your listeners are interested, I suggest looking at the other Middle East Forum reports on federal funding, which we published, I think, 2-3 a year on federal funding for the last 5 years now. And everything from madrasas in New York and Chicago to private schools run by Deobandis, just the most extraordinarily diverse collection of radicals are benefiting from the public purse. And yeah, it doesn't stop at USA.
Wow. And for those viewing and listening, if you are watching this on the YouTube version in the future, I will be sure to link the aforementioned reports in the video description below. I've got a few more questions for you here, and then I will open the floor to audience questions. But moving to the the actionable parts that can be done about this, what are some of the laws and policies that need to change?
I think one of the things I mentioned before was there have been some very explicit decisions made in the federal government not to enforce existing law. And that's a huge part of it. I mentioned Helping Hand for Relief and Development. They broke the law. They partnered with a designated terrorist organization. Why have they not been? Why has someone in Helping Hand for Relief and Development not been prosecuted for that decision? The same goes for Rama Worldwide. It was signing agreements with Hamas, taking money from a designated terrorist organization based in Kuwait and partnering with all sorts of other radicals. It was breaking the law. Not only was it not prosecuted, but its head official was invited to the White House to meet with the National Security Council. We've got more examples of this. We've written separately on, and it goes outside then the question of federal funding, by the way. We've written on a big network based out in California of Iranian pistachio farmers who have extremely close ties with the IRGC in Iran, to the extent they share business interests with the IRGC in Iran, while funneling money to radicals through their nonprofit foundations here in the US. I mention them because it's another example of the law not being enforced. These people appear very overtly to break sanctions rules. No interest from Treasury in prosecuting that. You could look at Department of Justice as well. The number of foreign agents operating on behalf of radical foreign principals who should be investigated by the Department of Justice's FARA unit is astonishing. We come across them all the time. Again, that is a law, that is an office that prosecutes and investigates very selectively. So a lot of this is about equal and consistent application of the law. The federal government has the statutory tools, it chooses not to use them. And some of that may fall back to the point I made earlier, whereby the federal government is treating some Islamists as allies in the fights against other Islamists. That said, there are certain things that can change that would still make any administration's job easier, regardless of the political will to prosecute. One is the question of vetting and how the federal government chooses its partners. Now, there are some constitutional complications here because, especially when it comes to a subject like Islamism, the Islamists make damn sure to convince anyone that any act of discrimination against them is akin to a religious discrimination, not a political one. But I'm sure that I'm convinced there's a way that the federal government can work with Muslims without partnering with Islamists. There's a reason you don't see violent Christian nationalist groups getting federal contracts and grants. They found a way to discriminate between extremist Christians and regular Christian groups for the most part in the federal government. They can do the same with the Muslim community as well. So serious vetting changes, serious changes to the way that government picks its partners would be ideal. The problem is that Islamists are embedded so deeply into the federal government's funding structures. I mean, take even the Department of Defense, take the Pentagon. It still uses the Islamic Society of North America to vet its chaplains. And the Islamic Society of North America is perhaps one of the founding Islamist organizations in the United States that has been radical since its birth, and today has strong links with hostile foreign governments. Across the federal government, this is a problem. So stronger vetting and a set of certain rules can be implemented to do this. Should you be able to fund an organization whose staff openly praise a designated terrorist organization? You would think not, but that's not an issue for current USAID vetting rules. In fact, current USAID vetting rules allow, this is actually a very good example, and I'm sorry, let me get into a tiny bit of detail for just a second. If I am an organization in Gaza and I am working with Hamas, if USAID decides to fund me as a sub-awardee, so that's where the money goes to another group first and then to me. So maybe the money goes to, say, something like the Islamic Relief, very prominent Western charity that's received USAID monies in the past. Then Islamic Relief give the money to me, a sub-awardee. Well, what vetting has to be done? Islamic Relief is the one trusted to vet me. Islamic Relief is an Islamist organization. But even where they have to vet and they have to send names over to USAID, they only have to send key individuals, that's the phrase, key individuals' names of me, of my organization. Who identifies as a key individual in my organization, I decide that. So if I want to make my intern the key individual and send that to USAID for vetting, but ignore the 3 Hamas Politburo members actually working in the office, I can do that under USAID vetting rules. So that there was the laxness, the self-evident foolishness of USAID vetting rules was absurd. And if you read the Inspector General's reports published in the last few years, where they looked at the vetting problems at USAID, they make it very clear how easily exploitable the entire system is. So a lot can be done, a lot can be fixed through simple changes of vetting that make it impossible for supporters of violence to receive government monies, which you would think would be something already written in the books. But no, it's not a policy at the federal level. For the most part, an organization is bound by really just one rule. Is this recipient organization on the designation list? Has it been designated a terrorist organization? And of course, as we've discussed over the last half an hour, Hamas doesn't operate that way. It operates through charitable fronts. Same for Lashkar-e-Taiba, same for Hizbul Mujahideen, same for all these terrorist groups. They operate through charitable fronts. And this is precisely why they do it, because they can now get external funds without having to directly take money as a designated terrorist organization themselves. So yeah, a lot can be fixed with language changes, with policy changes. But I go back to that. My first point is that the biggest impact the federal government could have is by enforcing existing law.
Now, MEF's report has, as I mentioned, it's really been making the rounds. It's getting picked up all over the place. But has anyone else sounded the alarm over USAID funding of these groups?
No, I mean, yes, the Inspector General's office has been pretty good. There have been a few other organizations who've noted things over the years. There are groups out there who talk about who track federal government funding more broadly, and mostly from a sort of bloated bureaucracy agenda. But really, the Middle East Forum has been the only group tracking this seriously the last few years. We have a database filled with just about $500 million worth of federal government monies that we've collected over the years, and we've released quite a bit of it. There's still more to go. One of the huge problems is that we think we've probably underreported the amounts, because federal government spending data is not to be trusted. In fact, just we've got a report coming out soon on DHS funding of Islamists. Just yesterday, I was looking for some of the DHS grants that we'd previously logged. I know they've been deleted from the federal spending database. I can still find evidence that they existed, but they've been deleted from the main site. Now, accidents, bureaucrats not operating a database effectively, who knows? I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I'll just point out they're not there, grants that were there. Moreover, we know that grants that did happen have never been there. For example, I mentioned the Unlimited Friends Association earlier, this Gaza-based charity. Well, it got money through a group called ANERA, American Near East Refugee Agency. USAID gives money to ANERA. ANERA gave money to UFA to build a community center in Gaza. We know this grant happened because USAID talk about it in a blog post on their website. They celebrate the construction of the Unlimited Friends Association Community Center in Gaza. It does not appear, this grant, anywhere in federal spending records. So monies to terrorist proxies isn't being misreported, not reported, underreported. There's also the question of reporting accuracy as well. And I can't tell you how many times we've rechecked a grant a few months later to find that the amounts allegedly outlaid to this group has changed by 100%. Yeah, we have no we have no good way of knowing for certain the accuracy of this data. I'm convinced that if we had unfettered access to federal spending records, we'd find at the very least 50% more federal funding of radicals than we currently have. Oh, and of course, the other huge point to mention, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned this earlier. I know this has been a bit of a scattered conversation, but I'm going back and forth between things. But if you'll bear with me, one of the huge issues with USAID money in particular is that it moves money to anonymous grantees. And this somewhat falls this happens for two reasons. One, there are parts of the world where you may genuinely not want your grantees publicly known to be receiving USAID monies. Maybe it's dangerous for them, especially you can think of certain parts of the world, I'm sure, where that might be the case. The other point is that USAID operates to some extent as an arm of American soft power and American intelligence agendas. And there are places in Syria where USAID and intelligence activities have been very much coordinated and planned. We know that's the case. The problem is to do this, to hand out these monies, the federal government then, of course, is obliged to report them, but it reports them as anonymous grantees. I think the phrase they use on federal records is miscellaneous grantees. And we're not talking small amounts here. We're talking tens of billions of dollars. So tens of billions of dollars are given to these groups. Now you're thinking, well, fine, but if these are very carefully coordinated grants to very specific groups, maybe it's fine. It's absolutely not fine. The Department of Justice had to prosecute someone just last year for moving millions of dollars to Jabhat al-Nusra, millions of dollars of USAID funds. Now we found the grant IDs for these embezzled funds, and we tracked them back to, guess what? These anonymous grants. So the government can't keep track of its anonymous grants, and the public has no way of holding them to account because we don't know what they're funding or where that money is going. So billions of dollars of anonymous grants, how much of that went to additional terrorist groups not included in our data? Who knows? Could be billions more for all we know. This is a horrifying situation. And whatever one thinks of DOGE and the new Trump administration, it is very clear from my perspective that a huge amount of waste and cover-up has led to the overt financing of American enemies, of terrorist groups bent on causing harm to the United States. This simply cannot continue. And whether wiping out USAID is a good idea is up for grabs. But at the very least, not a single cent of US taxpayers' money should ever be put out there without complete and thorough public review and scrutiny first.
It is, as you say, a horrifying situation, but you almost just can't help but laugh at the absurdity of the lack of oversight there. Now, if USAID is successfully folded into the State Department, as appears to be the intention, will this solve the problem of the federal subsidizing of extremism and terrorist organizations?
No, because, as I've mentioned, this problem goes far beyond USA. In fact, our report mentions State Department monies that are going to these terror groups and radicals as well. The risk is, in fact, that, as I mentioned, the Inspector General's office at USAID was doing some good work. The risk is that the good work they did, the lessons they learned, are now lost as USAID is destroyed and its remnants absorbed into state. I don't know what the State Inspector General's office is doing or thinking, given the behavior of state in recent years and its fundings of Islamism. I can't imagine that they have. I wouldn't expect to see states stopping funding to Islamists over the next few years based on their behavior. I think, if anything, because state is even less transparent than USA, partly because it's the Foreign Service arm of the United States, I imagine it will become even harder to track federal funding of Islamists under this new arrangement. If state absorbed USAID and said at the same time, we are going to open up the process by which we fund third parties, both domestically and overseas. Every application will be made public. Every report on the program's progress will be made public. Every vetting document will be made public. We'll publish lists of every applicant for a grant. All these things so that media, Congress, the public, the Middle East Forum can assist the government in ensuring it doesn't fund radicals. Then I would have confidence that this move will work. But currently, under the current plans, no. It seems to me this is going to make a murky system even murkier.
Now, your report touches on, of course, USAID and the U.S. State Department, but what do other government departments and their funding of Islamism look like?
Well, I mentioned what did I mention? I mentioned the Pentagon and so on. I mentioned Health and Human Sciences giving money to groups like Rama, this Hamas-aligned charity. But actually, if you look at the top donors federal donors to Islamist groups, alongside state and USAID, it actually turns out to be groups like Department of Agriculture. Department of Education is very high up there. And this is because of the endless subsidy programs, especially school voucher programs that Islamists take a lot of advantage of. A lot of money, comes from perhaps slightly less than expected places. Department for Homeland Security, as I mentioned, is a big one. It's not the biggest, but it is significant, and that's through two revenue streams. One is the National Security, the Non-Profit Security Grant Program, which is a congressionally appropriated program to provide security for religious institutions. And it shouldn't surprise you that groups like CARE and other well-known radical organizations benefit from this enormously. And it's not just Muslim Brotherhood stalwarts like CARE, but obscure Deobandi madrasas out in Chicago and radical mosques out on the West Coast and so on. So it's a mix of groups that benefit from this program. The other part of DH's funding of Islamists is through FEMA. And a group like ICNA Relief, for example, that's the Islamic Circle of North America, they're part of that Jamaati Islami South Asian Islamist network I mentioned earlier. They have received, under the Trump administration, I think, almost 10 million, which I believe is the largest grant ever given, single grant ever given to an Islamist organization. The Trump administration handed them 10 million in, don't quote me on the date, around 2018, I think. It's just astonishing the amount of money that can be handed out under some of these unregulated programs. And again, it's not something that's ever really caused much outrage or sparked investigation, despite the fact that this group, ICNA Relief, also has partnered with radical and terror-aligned groups, both here in the US and abroad as well. So yeah, there's a lot of money going around. I can actually give you a sum that I'm working on, a sort of a total amount of federal monies going to Islamists. We haven't published this figure yet, so let's just use this podcast to premiere. We think it's around $430 million has gone to Islamist groups, domestic Islamist groups, from the federal government this is since 2008. So that's a lot of money. Now, USAID and state is the plurality, as I mentioned, at around 164, but there's a lot of additional funds there. This is extrapolating a bit because we have to work out for the amounts that we know haven't been recorded that have been authorized but not outlaid, or vice versa. Money's outlaid, but no official record of them being authorized. There's a lot to work out here. We'll never come up with a truly accurate figure. I would also point out that where we've also looked into state and city funding, we have been horrified by the amounts, far more than you would think. It's possible that adds up to the hundreds of millions of dollars as well from states and cities, governments across the country. So all in all, we could be talking about $1 billion worth of federal, state, and city funding of Islamist groups in the United States. This is a big industry, and the taxpayer is a big part of that.
That is, those are just staggering figures. It's more money than most of us will ever pay in taxes in our lifetimes, and what we do pay is just a drop in the bucket or a rounding error for the larger amounts there. Now, I will turn the floor over to audience questions now, and I will begin with a question from Daniel Pipes, who says, "Thank you, Sam, for your excellent work. Do you see Islamist sympathizers having a role in U.S. government decisions to fund Islamists?"
Not as much. Well, how much we don't know, of course, is something we don't know. We come across examples of Islamists in positions where they can very evidently influence funding, appropriations. One example that we want to look into, and I don't see a reason we shouldn't mention it publicly, is there's a charity called Med Global. We identified it in a 23 report as one of the big Hamas-aligned charities in the United States. And we called it that because it was partnering with Hamas's Ministry of Health in Gaza. The head of that charity, his son was appointed a very senior USAID official under the Biden administration. And there are similar examples to this. It's often the family members, close family members of prominent Islamist leaders, especially within the charitable sector. Prominent family members being appointed to usually political appointments within, big federal departments. It's very possible they are guiding some of these monies. That said, I've had, and my colleagues have had a lot of conversations with federal officials and inspector general officers over the past few years. And it really goes back to, I think, the stupidity of bureaucrats on the one hand to misunderstand the people and groups with which they're coordinating and funding. And the other part is the other point I made, that the government has actively courted Islamist groups and funded them as part of a strategic ideological agenda.
Thank you. Now, Lawrence Moore would like to ask, how do you distinguish between fraudulent application of funds by USAID to Hamas and Hamas stealing these funds as it appears to do with UN aid?
So I think at no point have we ever identified a grant in our own set of data where we believe that money was misused. As mentioned, Hamas operates in genuine charitable activities, as do these other terrorist groups. So this aid, this money is going towards charity. It just so happens that it's charity specifically designed to prop up an ideological and terrorist network. So no, we've never seen examples of USAID's funded monies or supplies being pilfered by Hamas. I mentioned Rama earlier, Rama Worldwide, this Michigan charity. They have been accused of allowing Hamas or other armed gangs in Gaza to take their supplies, their aid infrastructure, their aid trucks then to Gaza. In fact, they got into quite a lot of hot water in Palestinian media about it. That wasn't USAID, that wasn't taxpayer-funded aid, however, that we know of. So no, this is primarily, and I'll repeat, this is very much a lawful enterprise for the most part. It's a lawful enterprise. These are lawful charitable movements funding genuine charitable fronts for terror in places like the Gaza Strip. They don't need to engage in illegality because they know they can do just as much damage operating under the deeply imperfect legal charitable infrastructure instead.
Great, thank you. Now, we've largely been discussing this funding of terrorist organizations as it pertains to groups like Hamas, But you also touched on the funding of South Asian Islamists and Deobandi groups. Now, Don Sable would like to ask, has the US really been giving a huge amount of money to the Taliban, and how large has it truly been?
Not unfortunately not my subject. I mean, I track it a little out of sheer curiosity. So yeah, there's a lot of money going to Afghanistan. Where we do track Afghan money is actually from Islamist charities here in the US. There's a very big Chicago network of Taliban funders that we did a report on last year. They operate in cahoots with a German Salafi charity, and they're essentially operating as Taliban charitable contractors, building infrastructure across the country, particularly schools. But no, federal money wasn't in the mix on that network that we know of. As for US money more broadly, government money going to Afghanistan, I mean, there's plenty of anecdotal evidence and a lot of very credible allegations in the media. Unfortunately, not my subject, so I won't say more.
All right, well, thank you. An anonymous attendee would like to ask, while the federal government acting on USAID abuses is welcome, is there any political will to go after the source, aka the Muslim Brotherhood or Qatar?
Well, not Qatar, certainly. I'm afraid that too many. Well, we'll see what will happen, but certainly the Trump administration regards Qatar very favorably. There's no doubt about that. Too many high-profile Trump administration officials are former lobbyists for Qatar. I don't see anything happening, but my colleagues at the forum are much more educated on the subject of Qatar. Maybe they'll disagree, but I think my impression is the general consensus is that we've got some work to do if we're to convince the Trump administration to turn against Qatar as a major funder of terror. As for the Muslim Brotherhood more broadly, no, I've seen very little appetite to resurrect the bill under the first Trump administration to designate the Muslim Brotherhood. I know there are conflicting opinions in the counter-Islamist field about the utility of such a bill. In fact, there's conflicting opinions within the Middle East Forum on the utility of such a bill. Personally, I'm against it. I find the Muslim Brotherhood to be a very nebulous network. I see no coordination these days to speak of, really, between the American Muslim Brotherhood, or what survives of it, and say the Egyptian Brotherhood, or indeed, groups like Anada or the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood. It's a disparate collection under a dissipated umbrella that we just loosely call the Muslim Brotherhood. No, there's no, as far as I'm aware, there's no specific plan to go after the Muslim Brotherhood writ large. I would like to see from the Trump administration a specific plan to go after specific American Islamist groups. And I think there is a very good case to be made, as some of which has been outlined today, that you can show clear logistical networks that are supporting terror. And I think that has a much better chance of succeeding than going after something as globally nebulous as the Muslim Brotherhood, because you can show institutions, finances, shared officials, shared staff, documentation, showing a very carefully coordinated network. I would start with the Hamas network in the United States. I would then expand to the Deobandis, who are moving huge amounts of money back and forth, especially from a place like Pakistan. And then I would look at a new generation of Salafi charities that are very quickly becoming very financially powerful and resourceful. These are networks you can track, and if you can track them properly, you can prosecute them when they break the law.
Thank you. Now, we've the focus of this podcast and of your report has been American financing of terrorism and Islamism. Sarah Schaffer would like to ask, can you provide any information of Canadian government grants supporting terrorist groups?
Good question. We're working on this. Canadian federal funding is difficult to obtain. Every time we think we've got a total data set that turns out not to be comprehensive. We're working on this. We know it's quite a lot. We know it's out there, and we know it's through some really problematic groups, some of which, in fact, are the same groups we've identified receiving US federal funds. We are working on this. Depends what happens at the next Canadian elections. Things might be easier under a new Canadian government to get this information. A number of attempts through public records requests have not been successful, or at least are in the process. not being successful. We might start, in lieu of a full data set, start publishing the small data points here and there that we've found. We were hoping to have sort of a comprehensive answer for everyone before we put it out there, but given the time this is taking, yeah, we might start drip releasing what we have so far. But it's a good question, and please stay tuned. It's coming.
Thank you. Now, we have a question from Jill Altschuler who asks, how can you get this information widely publicized? Obviously, the mainstream media would never report on this information for their viewers. So what is the best course of action to disseminate this more broadly?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of coverage of our report and of our director, Greg Roman, his testimony in Congress within certain mostly conservative circles. A few passing mentions in centrist or leftist media, but it's getting coverage within aspects of the right. As to make this a more globally reported problem or reported by the big cable news networks and so on, I don't know. We've been trying for many years to get folks to. But the big problem, and if you watch the committee hearing, you'll notice from both sides of the House, you'll notice this, is that no one really, very few people really wants to talk about this openly and honestly. Everything must become a partisan political question. When we tried to report Trump administration funding under the first Trump administration, no conservative paper would report it, would even let us publish with them, because it was inconvenient for their side. Now we have something that's a little more, our USAID report is mostly inconvenient for the Biden administration. So the conservatives are willing to report it, but of course the left won't touch it. So it's an old problem. I don't know the solution to the highly hostile media environment in the United States. We've been working on it for a while. The best thing we all can do in the meantime is share this report ourselves as citizen journalists and sharers of news. So social media, newsletters, all these things, reach out to your local politicians and your local journalists, see if you convince them to buck the trend and actually report what is going on. And also look to see what's happening in your local area. I mean, I mentioned city and state funding as a huge problem as well, and we're yet to explore the full scope of it. Your city may very well be funding many of these charities we've discussed tonight. These charities do seek out local funding. You can go. I saw a peculiar grant from a small town in Oklahoma the other day to one of the Hamas charities we track. Don't assume just because you don't live in New York City that your local government is not funding some of these terror groups. They're these terror aligned groups. It happens. These charities deliberately set up local branches around the country precisely in order to solicit these kind of funding programs. So research yourself if you can. Get the list of grants your local government has made to nonprofits over the last 10 years and search for it by keyword or send it to us and we'll do that and we'll write it up. We need your help not just in the dissemination of the information, but the collection of it as well.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Sam. I believe we've now reached the end of our podcast for the week. I want to thank you again for taking the time and for letting us pick your encyclopedic knowledge on the subject. For future reports or for any of the past reports that you mentioned, is there a place where you would direct our viewers and listeners to go if they would like to follow more of that research?
Yeah, we have a category we have an outlet on the Middle East Forum website, meforum.org, called Focus on Western Islamism. You can find it in the media section of the ME Forum website. We have a subcategory in that outlet of government funding of Islamism. So you can see everything we've published on this subject over the past few years there, which is quite a bit. We also like to publish with our larger reports all of the raw data as well. So if you want to check things out for yourself or scroll through the raw data or do anything you want with it, that should be there for you to download. And then finally, if you do have additional questions or tips and want to tip us off to something or send us data, please get in touch. I love getting information. So send me information if you have it.
All right. Well, thank you again, Sam. We appreciate you taking the time to share your information with us. Now, please be sure to join us for viewers and listeners tomorrow for our Israel Insider podcast at 3 p.m. Eastern Time with Ashley Perry. And we would also like to take this time to invite you to the Middle East Forum's annual policy conference in Washington, D.C. It'll be taking place the week of May 19th, and you can register at our website. The website is just www.emiforum.org/policyconference 2025, all one word. We thank you all again for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I hope to see you for tomorrow's podcast. Thank you.